Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, May 21st, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization now representing a growing body of more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition, demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part two, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction. Today, we're looking at part three, the Twin Towers and extreme heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of extremely high temperatures and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these towers. Before we go further, though, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which do occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. Best way to submit them is to go to the questions and information forum online at ae911truth.org. You just go to our page and find continuing education and find the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. I'll also be looking at our AE911 Truth Facebook page and our YouTube channel for comments under this webinar or questions that may appear related to this material, so you can try to submit them there as well. And so with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for hosting our 9/11 Freefall. What's up this time, the latest?
Well, tonight we're featuring another one of our unsung heroes. It's volunteer Xander Arena. He heads our verifications team. We got a very strict standard for when people sign the petition as an architectural or engineering professional. He leads up that effort and makes sure that that all the degrees are collected. And he'll be talking about that and talking about, of course, 9/11 from his own perspective as well. So you can tune that in tonight on No Lives Radio or on BBS Radio on Sunday, or you can go right to our Facebook page and it'll be posted there.
Great. And Andy's going to let you know later if you want to also be a volunteer like Xander. We've got lots of opportunities for you. Appreciate that, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time into the 9/11 Truth effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So I encourage you to become one of the 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. So with that in mind, let's have a quick review of the scientific method. We've had it in the West for nearly 100 years, and it's how we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. This is what we're about today. We have a question. What brought down the towers? Okay, we do background research, we make observations, we construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the towers came down based on the research that we've done. All of the hypotheses are laid out without respect to our own personal, political, or financial obligations, which might sway our objective opinion. We don't focus in, for instance, on one to the exclusion of others. We make predictions based on these hypotheses, i.e. if it was jet planes, what would be true? If it was fire that brought the towers, the ensuing fires down, what then would be true? Or maybe it was the explosions, which we looked at ample evidence of last week in this three-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Controlled demolition, which we'll be looking at even more evidence today. These are all reasonable hypotheses for open-minded, objective inquirers. We test these with experiments, these hypotheses. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. We don't hide the input data in our computers, for instance, as NIST has admitted doing, and to the excluding the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. If these high rises can come down, in the case of Building 7, not even due to a plane hitting them, as we saw last week in this 3-part series, then we have to know about that. We need the input data that NIST used in their 7-year study of this building. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we'll find that NIST's was not, we go back again, as we're doing today, construct a new hypothesis with supporting evidence until we find that it is corroborated. It matches up with the experiments, the results, the analysis, and so forth. So with that in mind, let's look at some buildings that were destroyed. In fact, fire is a destructive process. It's an organic and chaotic destructive process. In fact, burns an area out in 20 minutes or so, moving on, looking for fresh new combustibles. This is even acknowledged by NIST, who says such fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. They move on. So this is clearly acknowledged. So we've never lost a skyscraper before 9/11 due to fire. But say in a wood frame building, the building would fall in stages. It wouldn't just fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the tons of structure beneath it, but it would tend to fall over. And so what about steel frame buildings? We had the largest test of its kind, British Steel in Cardington, the 1995. They put incredible fuel loads inside this 8-story building, which they built for the purpose of burning it down to find out what would happen. The steel, as you see, some of which was fireproofed and some of which was not fireproofed. It's because they wanted to know what would happen in both cases. So this is an incredibly important precedent. And let's find out what they discovered. Oops, that one's not going to play for us. I'll fix that for you next time. But what they did find is that the steel is an extremely, here it is.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. Of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire, and the impacts of jet planes, of course, on the Twin Towers. What the conclusions of this study is that it's inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Okay, well, how about buildings that fall due to natural causes? In this case, earthquakes, where there's a natural gravitational collapse. So these buildings fell over to the path of least resistance. Again, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the incredible structure and all the tons of columns beneath. We recognize the building as a building. It's not like a house of cards. The columns and the beams are not dismembered one from another. So this is extremely important. And the concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So keep this in mind also, because this is what we might expect, something like this at the Twin Towers. It's not what we got. What we got was more in the order of this. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pyroclastic-like flow due to the incredible heat released from the chemical reactions, from the chemicals and explosives. creating rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes, which create a solid advancing edge between at the edge of the smoke line, if you will. And we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Now, explosions can be harnessed very effectively to bring high-rises down in a process known as controlled demolition, which you see several examples of here, where teams of explosive loaders place shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonate them in a very precise order. It's not done by fires. This is done by extremely skilled structural engineers and others. It's quite a science to bring a building down in a controlled fashion like this. And so it creates a set of features associated with it that we're going to be looking at today. What are these features? Well, the typical ones are a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, if that's what they want to accomplish, resulting in a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, if that's what they also want to accomplish, because there's a pattern of removal of column supports that's timed to achieve the results that they want, which results in a free fall acceleration, often straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the tons of structural steel columns in the way of the descent of the building. And of course, resulting in feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, with limited damage to adjacent structures and patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses, with broken up concrete floors. Also, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. You don't want to have to go back later and jackhammer those floors. Let the explosives do the work. And feature number 5, there's squibs or explosive charges, isolated explosive ejections visible at many floors. Feature number 10, chemical evidence of explosives left behind in the residue, of course. If you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction. Now, fires don't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse. They do so asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. Like these fires, for instance, well, not like these fires, because these fires are in skyscrapers. We have not lost a skyscraper due to a high-rise fire before 9/11. Let's look at a few of them.
May 4th, 1988, the first Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. One firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, not one of them did. But all of a sudden on 9/11, we have not two, but three structures. Not this one, though, completely engulfed in fire. If any of the structures were expected to be collapse at 9/11, we'd expect it to be this one, right? No collapse. No, mid-rise and high-rise structures do not collapse due to fires when they're fireproofed. And that's why we fireproof them. And this is it's been a mystery to people why the towers came down. Well, one reason with the beauty of steel frame buildings is that the steel conducts that heat away from the source. So the steel never gets to its critical temperature of 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Well, just to keep that from ever becoming a problem, we fireproof it. We put on 6 times more fireproofing than is necessary because, as NIST acknowledged, the fires only last 30 minutes in a given area or so. So 3-hour fire protection is fantastic. And to keep that from becoming a problem, we regulate highly what the owners can bring into the building, into the tenants, and what the buildings are made out of by the owners. They're non-combustible materials. And then we sprinkler these buildings on top of that to keep that from ever becoming a problem. So the sprinklers were said to have been compromised by the impacts of the airplanes in the case of the Twin Towers, according to the official story. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, we can get more information, right? Government documentation can be very helpful. You have to get permits for buildings. You don't just bring them down in a controlled demolition quickly. So there's foreknowledge typically of the destruction of these buildings. Experts agree later on, in the aftermath, looking at the videos, for instance, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations, which might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building collapse has been a controlled demolition. We'll be looking at some objective experts today. With video documentation, of course, this can be proof of controlled demolition. With this in mind, let's apply that proof to the destruction of the Twin Towers, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts? Now, we looked at this last week in series part 2 of this series. We found that was the case. Sudden onset, no hesitation. We found that there was a patterned set of explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. We found that there was a straight down, at least initially, a symmetrical progression of destruction outside the footprint in the case of the explosive destruction of the Twin Towers, versus with Building 7, it was all inside, a classic implosion. And then we found there was ejections of building materials at the floors that landed 600 feet in every direction, 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections weighing, landing 600 feet and ejected at 60 to 80 miles an hour. We found that there was a free fall acceleration, almost 2/3 of free fall. The building did not slow down as it was meeting the incredible resistance of 80,000 tons of structure beneath, but it accelerated straight down through that incredible structure, shattering the structural steel frame from top to bottom into its individual elemental components, just about. And the lateral ejection we discussed, and the squibs we discussed also. The pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete in each building, and with the landing outside the footprint of the building, of course, in a 4-inch thick blanket over a 3 square mile area. So that concrete, that 90,000 tons of concrete in each building, couldn't have contributed to the collapse of this building, nor could the 80,000 tons of structural steel beneath, 100,000 tons altogether, because it was almost all, 98% of it, ejected laterally outside the footprint of the building. So there's 2/3 the weight of the building unavailable to crush the building. Think about that. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives is what we found there. Fire doesn't create any of those features, let alone all of them. So today we're moving on with feature 8, 9, and 10, the incredible heat produced here. Let's move into it. Because the National Fire Protection Association 921, the guide for investigation of fire and explosions, says look for thermal effects. That's what we're doing today. Large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, which we see ejecting out of the towers in every direction in all the photographs and all the videos, producing 10 times the volume of the building, which is an incredible volume of building as well as volume of hot gases. And surely those fires were extinguished on the way down. So what's producing all this hot gases after those fires were out, as you see here and here and here and here? Well, it's not these fires. Again, they were probably completely extinguished at the collapse of the building. And in any case, they're obviously oxygen-starved cooler fires indicated by the thick black smoke at the time of the collapse. We're looking for a lot more heat to produce that expansion of cauliflower-shaped plumes, like we see perhaps in something like this. So let's find out what it was, huh? As we look at feature number 9, evidence of molten iron in steel. Let's go to Massimo Mizuko.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out? There's still fire down below. There's such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and then the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
We had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Still rubble. It's still, I believe, 100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
This is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center, this gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've got some small windows into what we thought was a board at some point, and it's like nothing. It's just orange inside. It's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
We would create an air pocket by moving steel, shooting the fire from the ground. But, these underground fires were just like fire in hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell would look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You'd be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up firemen are coming out, and I went with the boots were like melted, and then the hose would come over and we would try to put that part out. I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
That's when the fires were still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Well, what are these witnesses saying about all this phenomena? Here's David Scott, structural engineer, was with Arup Associates. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. Dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center. Peter Tully, president of the Tully Construction Cleanup Company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event, molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down, metal dripping from a beam, molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping from the molten steel, with molten steel. Mark Loiseau, the president of another cleanup company, in this case, Controlled Demolition, Inc. Molten steel was encountered primarily during the excavation of debris. There are videotape and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. How about this structural engineer? A little river of steel flowing. The structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself, Leslie Robertson, a direct witness of flowing molten steel, and his associate, Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. As you see, pouring out of the tower, the South Tower, minutes prior to its collapse. We know by the color of this material, its temperature. We'll come to that. NIST says, oh, this must be molten aluminum from the airplane. Well, molten aluminum looks like this, silvery, doesn't glow bright yellow and white hot like you see in the material pouring out of the South Tower and out of the debris in the claws of this crab claw excavator. Well, what does the curator of the museum, one of them, this architect, Bart Vorsanger, say about these cooled meteorites?
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
Well, how did that happen? And this, in the police museum today, you can see molten concrete. Fire temperatures so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path, flowing in this case around this handgun, which was in the police headquarters under Building 6. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, there's a problem here. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. So how does that happen in office fires that aren't even 25% of that level of heat? We see the steel here documented by structural engineer Abelhausen Astani Assel, who had access to the landfill to study the steel under a National Science Foundation grant. It's evaporated. If you remember the Salvador Dali paintings, he says, it's kind of like that, melted. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. Well, try 2,800 degrees. Those are the temperatures needed. Here's more evidence.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Interesting. We're getting somewhere here. Let's go to FEMA, who in 2002 produced a report called the Building Performance Assessment Report, a metallurgical examination of the steel by FEMA, finding a 1-inch column reduced to half-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. This does not happen by office fires or jet fuel, as we'll see. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron, that's molten iron, that's elemental iron, invading the grain boundaries of the steel. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel, but no clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. It's perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, but completely omitted from the final NIST report. They took out this entire Appendix C when they took over the investigation in 2002. The presence of sulfur is clearly identified. NIST finally is forced to speculate because they have very frequently asked questions that they put up years later. Sulfur is present in gypsum wallboard. Wait a minute. That's calcium sulfate. That's not sulfur. Calcium sulfate is bonded. Besides, gypsum boards never turned around and attacked the steel that's been designed to protect for 100 years or so. You can even do experiments. Build your own extremely hot fire, the hottest fire you can build, like this one, and put gypsum board and pieces of gypsum board in there. See if you can get it to attack the steel. Nope, you can't. John Cole tried it, civil engineer in Florida. The smell of sulfur, it burned, that smell, says John Field, iron worker at the site. John Gross, co-project leader of the NIST report. What does he have to say about this phenomenon?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
The cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Well, here he is on top of the pile, finding the very piece of steel that was cut off and sent to FEMA for their study in the inclusion by Worcester Polytechnic Institute for that Appendix C. And yet he's denying the evidence of these partially evaporated ends of the beams. This is from World Trade Center 7. His shadow is all over the evidence, though. Let's look at this. We've got fires maybe 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. NIST claims 1,800 degrees without any evidence to suggest that that might be true. But let's look at hydrocarbons like building materials, desks and chairs and carpet. Jet fuel as just a hydrocarbon. They don't burn hotter than 600 to 1,400 degrees. In fact, the ME Petroleum, the manufacturer of jet fuel A, says our jet fuel burns at 600 degrees in open air. That's the maximum, 600 degrees. So how are we getting temperatures so much hotter than these? Like what we see here, you can tell by the color of molten metals what its temperature is. In this case, 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the physics of it. So where are these temperatures coming from? And what caused all this steel to melt? Well, NIST has an answer to this in their very frequently asked question, published years later on their website. Any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile, rather than short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. There's a problem with this quip answer. There's a conservation of energy law. In a closed system, such as fires burning under pulverized concrete powder in the basements of the World Trade Center, for instance, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create more energy inside the system. In other words, if the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning, all you can do is convert the energy you have from one form to another. So the heat is dissipated. It's not increased. Number 10, forensic evidence of thermite incendiaries. What are we talking about here? Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just...
Oops. Sorry.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is
Play
a
that one
compound
again.
of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Hey, maybe we're getting somewhere here, finally, because if thermite were used, it would account for the extremely hot temperatures, 4,000 degrees, right? It would account for the elemental iron, which we're going to see a lot of evidence for. Not melted steel, as it turns out, but molten iron was documented by that FEMA report, invading the grain boundaries of the steel. It would also account for the sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, becomes much more effective at cutting through much thicker sections of steel, as we'll see. Well, the NFPA 921 says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says we found no evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. A year later, when pressed, they finally admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you're not looking for or not willing to look for. Others looked for it. It wasn't that hard to find. Here's Stephen Jones, a nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University. He does an analysis. He says, gosh, if thermite were used, you'd expect a characteristic burn pattern with white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. You'd see a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like you see rising from the top of this liquid molten iron pouring out of the South Tower. And like you see trailing these 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections weighing 8 tons ejected out of the tower horizontally, which we looked at last week in part 2 of this series. But wait a minute. I thought structural steel is not flammable. What's burning the ends of these beams such that they're shooting like a rocket out of here? All of them. We've got some inquiry to do, right? You can't light steel with an office fire or with jet fuel. Think about it. Something's producing that. What's burning on the ends of these steel beams? Looks more like a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, and freely flying structural steel sections. We have this going on thousands of times in both tower collapses.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
So how does that happen? Doesn't happen from jet fuel. Doesn't happen from office fires. Let's look at thermite. It would leave behind a unique chemical signature. Also, Stephen Jones says, common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but also more unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements in the periodic table of the elements. Well, a sculptor sent him a piece from this 40-pound chunk of previously molten material from the South Tower. And he does some analysis, electron microprobe data, finds that it's predominantly iron, so he can rule out molten aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese, so we can readily rule out structural steel as a major component. In other words, this is not melted steel beams. This is elemental iron. It has aluminum, sulfur, potassium in it as well. So here he determines that this is the signature of the residue of thermite. But it gets better than that. Manganese and fluorine in abundance. What? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Well, fluorine is used in sol gel type thermite charges, much more effective at cutting through steel. These sol gel super thermites, they're called. So these are often present in the residue and are part of a thermite fingerprint. It's really clear. But sol gels would also leave something else in the residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. Well, the EPA analysis finds one molecule present at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. He simply speculates that it might be from computers, but computers have been in every office fire that's ever done, and they've never found 1,3-diphenyl propane. Well, another sculptor from the Peace Park in Manitoba sends Dr. Jones this piece of slag hanging from the end of the steel beam because he heard about the work that he was doing. He performs X-ray fluorescence analysis, finds iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, carbon ingredients, and signature again of thermite. So he's on the path this time. Well, guess what? You can produce shaped cutter charges in your own backyard like civil engineer John Cole did, cutting cleanly through steel as you see here and here.
That was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait, where have we seen that before? Razor sharpness with a Swiss cheese appearance. Oh yeah, documented by FEMA in Appendix C from the structural steel from the Twin Towers. Appendix C, which was thrown out, the metallurgical examination from the final NIST report. Well, there's been devices patented prior to 9/11, which are shaped cutter charges that use thermite, and they issue molten iron in less than hundreds of milliseconds. Much more effective at cutting through thicker sections of structural steel like you have at the World Trade Center with minimum 4-inch thick slabs, 3 of them at the bottom of all these columns in both of these towers. And there are devices that have been developed prior to 9/11 whose casings themselves are made out of consolidated thermite, which is consumed upon ignition. All that would be left behind is pools of molten iron. What else was found in the World Trade Center dust, though? Fascinating studies by the U.S. Geological Survey, in all their dust samples in their 2005 particle atlas of World Trade Center dust. All the samples have these previously molten iron, elemental iron, microspheres, billions of them. Up to 6% of many of these dust samples are composed of these previously molten iron microspheres. By extrapolation, up to 4 tons of this material exists in all the World Trade Center dust. 150 times more than common office building dust, which you see on the left, which is not molten iron, and it's not spherical. R.J. Lee Group, doing independent studies on this dust, find that these are formed during the event, not before in construction, not after by the iron workers doing deconstruction or cleanup, but during the construction. They're absolutely ubiquitous. In fact, they're used as a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. Well, how does thermite work? Here's a controlled experiment, very small experiment producing thousands of what we think are sparks, but what are actually cooling, falling, liquid, molten iron microspheres. You see, aerosolized liquid forms itself into spheres. That's just what the surface tension does. Hold on a second. So when you sneeze, you're producing spherical droplets, very small. And Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars? Liquid molten iron droplets. Largest of them are about 1/16 of an inch. Some of them are naked to the human eye. In this extremely hot event, is there any other explanation that makes any sense for the toasting of the tops of these cars? Okay, well, what's the source of it? Let's go back to the dust and see what was found by a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, who examined 7 dust samples independently. They had time to document 4 of them in a peer-reviewed paper. The dust samples were collected in various places, as you see here. One from an apartment directly across the street from the South Tower, Jeanette McKinley's apartment. Her windows blew in that explosive destruction of the South Tower, and her apartment filled with this dust. She collected it and used it for her art projects and paid for that decision with her life, which very tragically ended with brain cancer about 10 years ago, I think. And one of these samples was hers. The other 3 collected, again, independently. All the samples had these curious red-gray chips. They thought they were paint at first, but the team found that they were attracted to a magnet. They get real curious. What is this? It must have iron content, right? So they zoom in to and do on the X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the red layer and find what? The ingredients of unignited thermite. Wait a minute. We have the residue of ignited thermite in the molten iron microspheres, and now we have the residue of unignited thermite here with aluminum and sulfur and silica oxygen carbon, organic materials. We'll come back to that. So they get real curious and zoom in 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope and find what? Nano-sized particles of aluminum platelets and rhomboidal-shaped iron oxide crystals, the ingredients of thermite. Thermite is made up of iron oxide, which is rust, and aluminum powder. Well, here at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair, these engineered particles are embedded in a matrix of oxygen, silica, carbon. The organic material is what produces the expansion or concussive force in TNT. So this is extremely interesting because the incendiary thermite has been apparently engineered to become more explosive here. When they put it in a scanning calorimeter, as documented before 9/11 in the Los Alamos laboratory, they find that indeed this material at 758 degrees Fahrenheit ignites, producing much more energy. So this energy release is typical of exothermic reactions, which is exactly what the 4 samples did from the World Trade Center dust. So they know they're behaving exactly like the super thermite developed at Lawrence Livermore Lab. And when they do ignite, they produce what? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical features signature as the molten iron microspheres produced from the world, found in the World Trade Center dust and documented. So we know where those microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips, as if we didn't know. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that can be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. And that's what we're about, justice for the 9/11 victims. What they've done here, whoever they are, is engineer an incendiary to become more explosive, because when you get these particles down to the nanoscale, they become, the surface volume increases exponentially. So the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous. This material is very sophisticated. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So they determined that this is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, highly energetic, pyrotechnic or explosive material. It's documented in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, 25-page peer-reviewed paper. It stands uncontested. Nobody has submitted a paper challenging the results of this work. That's how you challenge somebody's conspiracy theory in the peer-reviewed world. This has not been done. So this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives, what we've seen just today. No evidence of destruction from fire in any of these three categories of not typical, but fairly atypical controlled demolition. Fire doesn't produce these features, any of them, let alone all of them, especially these fires, which are not hot and indicating by the FLIR heat signature videos, under 250 degrees at the time of the collapse. And so we go to the experts. Well, what do they say? At least those experts who aren't swayed by their own financial or political forces that could sway their objective opinion. Let's go to one of the 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth. Like Ron Brookman, for instance, doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the towers become inevitable, as NIST said in their review, which we'll get to? Why would all 110 stories drop straight to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer, signed on to the petition. Fires were weak. NIST reports confirm that steel temperatures were low. WTC collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. And let's go to Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, who says, as they were carting the steel away, just looking at a piece of metal doesn't generally tell you anything. This guy's a former engineering major. Speaking of which, that steel, what happened to it? Did they preserve it? No. We're talking about the destruction of evidence here. Let's go to Abolhaz Astani, structural engineer.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all this steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. So it's nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
Went to the melting pot. Starting 2 weeks after 9/11, the steel was going to barges sent to China for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads a day dumping this stuff off on these barges. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Altogether, prompting those of us who have been looking at this for a little while with an open mind through the scientific method to declare that the hypothesis of fire and jet planes bringing these towers down is ludicrous, that more likely explosions in the form of controlled demolition is the cause. That's what we've shown here today in features 8, 9, and 10. Last week, features 1 through 7, some typical and mostly very, again, atypical features of controlled demolition are direct evidence of explosive destruction and incendiary destruction. None of these are achievable through fire, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence that we've been looking at, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition. And that's why we have more than 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. And we would like you to join them. But first, let's see how we can get your questions answered today. Andy, we have questions?
We certainly do. So please submit any questions you might still have in the same input form we discussed earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Go under continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see the box. And we're going to do our best to answer them. While those are coming in, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved. If now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Oh, beautiful. So, okay, so then I'll let people know that those questions can be answered right there on our website. And while you're there, please subscribe to our email newsletter. There's a lot of great information that goes out on how we're getting a new investigation, all the progress we're making there, the new evidence coming out, and the articles that are written about us. Incredible stuff. And you can get informed on our website, by the way, right here. We have lots and lots of information, more videos than you've ever seen here. And sign the petition while you're there. You can support 3,000 architects and engineers. There's 20,000 others that are doing just that. Or if you're an architect or engineer, please sign on. Very important. Even if you have a degree in engineering, that's what we're looking for there. Donate to our work. We are supported only by you, actually. We have no other funding source other than you. So we have 6 employees that are busy getting this information out, and we're always scrubbing for financial support so that we can pay them. Sometimes we can't. And please, so become a member. Join the family of sustaining supporters of AE 911 Truth with your support. It's incredibly important. Look at that. I got one video that doesn't want to play. Don't know why. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so your donation is tax deductible. It sends us out to meet with architects, engineers in conferences all around the country. It enables us to send postcards. We've now sent 75,000 postcards. We've sent 50,000. We're trying to send another 25,000 to engineers, letting them know about Building 7 and the Professor Leroy Hulsey study, which I'm going to tell you about. And if you can't do that, help us. Lend a hand. There's all kinds of things you can do. Right, Andy?
Absolutely. And Richard, I just want to let you know your green screen went out here.
Oh,
so that's what we're seeing behind you. But absolutely, we need a lot of people to be part of this important effort. And a lot of people have been. But of course, we all have lives. We all have work schedules. Some of us have kids to look after. So these people do what they can, whatever they can. But we need people to back them up and fill in those gaps when life calls upon them. So what can you do here? There's many things. Like I said, Xander was on my show this week talking about the work that you can do with the verifications team. A lot of work involved in that. but very rewarding, and it makes our petition numbers, we can verify and stay on top of that. We have people who are reaching out to Congress right now. I mean, if that's just something you can do in the short run, I'll talk a little bit more about that in the Bobby McIlvain segment, but we have people who brainstorm ways to reach out to Congress. We have people who call on the phone out to, they were calling architects. They're going to be calling professors now again about the World Trade Center study. And of course, if you're a quiet, introverted person, you like to work by yourself, we can certainly use you in the data collection team and go out and find these contacts, because there's no central location of people to reach out to about World Trade Center 7 and the Twin Towers in one web page for us. We got to go out and find that stuff. Translations teams, many things you can do here, and we'll get talking to you and find out where you'll best fit in. It really depends on where you think you fit in. But the first step to all of this is going to our website, ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form on there. It's very simple. Fill it out. We'll give you a call. We'll have a talk, and we'll get you a part of the team. So please do that.
Thank you so much, Andy, and appreciate you telling me about that screen. We have a new computer coming in that's going to solve that problem, and that's the reason I got it, and I'm all excited about it. And I'm excited about the opportunities that people can work on their own. Even if you don't like working with other people, you can do these things at home. Contact your elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper, send them the AE 911 Truth link, send them our press releases that we put out and our stories. Every week we come out with a new story of some kind. Tell everybody you know, screen the DVDs that we have, share them, and the brochures. You can get 100 brochures and share them for about $10 from our online store. Share the results of the final report of the World Trade Center finite element modeling in Building 7 from Professor Leroy, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, spent 4 years studying the building and concluded. I'll show you what he concluded, but look at the incredible work they did using the Advocacy and the SAP software, determining that NIST completely apparently fabricated most of what they did there, because they find that fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7, which we looked at, by the way, in week 1 of this series. It's on YouTube, free. Download it or look at it on YouTube. 9/11, An Architect's Guide, World Trade Center Building 7. They said it didn't experience a progressive collapse, as NIST claimed. It was a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. What can cause that? Well, that evidence inspired 5 New York area city fire commissioners to pass a resolution demanding a new investigation into the destruction of the all three World Trade Center skyscrapers, and cause them to support the Bobby McIlvain Act. What is that anyway, Andy?
This is the Bobby McIlvain World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby McIlvain, who tragically lost his life that morning. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower lobby. He was actually at the morgue before the first of the 2 towers that morning collapsed. So by the very nature of how he died, we immediately have questions that conflict with the official story. So we've named it after him. Bob McIlvain has worked with us for years. His father has wanted a new investigation. What this would do is it would create a select committee. It can be passed in either House of Congress that would look into the information that Richard has presented here. We actually wrote it in such a way that they have to look into the evidence of controlled demolition if they pursue this. This is draft legislation, and basically we did all of the work for our members of Congress. They just have to take that step and introduce it and pass it. So that is where you come in as the constituents. We want you to know about this act. We want you to know the evidence. And you can learn about this act by going to ae911truth.org/justice. There you can download a little booklet that includes the legislation. It includes a letter from Richard, a letter from Bob McIlvain. And when your congressmen feel comfortable to come out and start facing constituents again after this pandemic stuff is over, You can go to town halls and hand it to them. In the meantime, you can write a letter to them. You don't even have to write the letter. We've already written it for you. You just put in your address, and it will automatically send the letter in your name to your congressmen and your senators. And that's important because they get a lot of emails, but they keep track of what the subjects are about. So if they get a lot of people writing to you, to them about the same thing, then that'll definitely go into their tallies, and they'll know this issue is very much alive and people want resolution to it. And we've got a lot of action going on right now with setting up congressional meetings. Supporters are contacting their representatives and setting up these meetings when they can with staffers at the congressman's office. And we're actually having a lot of fun with it, Richard and me and Roland. So we want to get more of them. We're having success, but we want more success. If you're not part of that action, please do so. You can write us at congress@ae911truth.org and just go to your congressman's website, and they usually have a form on there that you can fill out. And if you need any guidance, that is what I am here for. So please, we've got a lot of backup for you. We just need you as the constituent to take that first step. And then all of that action will inevitably lead to the passage of this Bobby McIlvain Act. So we got to get involved, and I hope you can. Please get involved.
Please do. There's lots to do. And just know that we're still waiting results from our mandamus action, which we've filed against the U.S. attorney in Manhattan, who had previously promised that he will comply with the law requiring him to hand our petition, which includes the information you've been getting today and a lot more, in 60 exhibits, to a special grand jury. That was his requirement. He hasn't, we have no evidence that he's done that yet. So we filed a lawsuit and we're waiting. We're also waiting for an appeal, which we've submitted. And that's for the FBI lawsuit. We've sued the FBI because they did not inform Congress of this evidence, even though they had it. Congress required them to give all the evidence to them that they had, which is extremely important evidence, as you can imagine, having seen this presentation now. We have, the judge actually ruled that in favor of the FBI, that said we don't have standing. Well, wait a minute. We're the family members. We're the architects. We're the engineers. We have a lot of standing, and that the truth comes out about what brought these towers down, right? We're not letting go of this. We're like the bulldog on the pants of the justice system in this case. So finally, I want to show you that we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence in this hour-and-a-half presentation here. I'm not going to play it all for you, but I want to show you a couple of minutes.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet.
which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic
Oops. Let's keep going here.
implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA and Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust cells. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Wow. Then we've got work to do, all of us. If NIST wasn't producing science, as you've seen today, you got to inform yourselves. And this is one way to do it, 1.5 hour video here. And it's free on YouTube, the 1 hour version. But this 1.5 hour version also includes excerpts from Meet the Experts, called Meet the Experts. Additional half hour interview from each of these 40 high-rise architects. Great stuff. And beyondmisinformation.org is a website where you can download our free 50-page booklet on this subject, or you can buy the hard copy in our store online at ae911truth.org. Our 2 hour version of this called 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, our classic lecture on this subject presentation. And then we have Ed Asner narrating our 15-minute version of the World Trade Center 7 PBS series. It's a high-quality production made for PBS and aired on PBS, the 5-minute version. So you can download this free on YouTube or buy the DVD from our store. Hey, let's get to those questions, Andy.
Okay, so last week we had to cut things short before the question and answer session. So we're going to, after we address this week's questions, we're going to address the questions from last week on the Twin Towers. Our first question from this week says that this question comes from Graham McQueen and Tony Zambotti's The Missing Jolt, a simple refutation of the NIST Bazant collapse hypothesis. It says the rapid descent of World Trade Center 1's roof does not demonstrate an observable decelerative change in velocity as the upper 15% of the building falls into the lower 85%. How did NIST calculate the impact load of the upper 15%? And is there an estimate of how far the stories 98 to 110 traveled with minimal resistance in their fall into the below structure? Bazant hypothesized that the upper 15% of the building maintained its integrity during the 100-story descent. The progressive collapse theory of 9/11 was first attributed to Zdeněk Bazant on 9/13/2001. what are the essential differences in the progressive collapse theories of Besant, FEMA, and NIST?
Okay, let's take them one at a time here. The rapid descent of the World Trade Center 1's, you can measure it from the top of the parapet on the building. We not the actual roof, just technicality. How did NIST calculate the impact load of the upper 15% section? And NIST, first of all, did not calculate it. They completely ignore it. In fact, in the NIST report, hidden on page 85 in footnote 13, they had their own objective, which we looked at last week. And they said their analysis went up to the initiation of collapse. But they were tasked by Congress to explain the collapses to the American people, which would require an analysis. So they simply say that after the initiation and collapse became inevitable, they simply say that the building came down essentially at free fall, that the lower mass below the point of jet plane impacts was unable to arrest the downward momentum of the upper mass. It's a paraphrase. So there's no analysis. Now, they rely for their theoretical support for their theory, which is not, by the way, a progressive collapse theory. It is a column failure theory, which we looked at last week, in which the perimeter columns near the point of jet plane impact in each of these towers bowed inward. And indeed, the videos show that they bowed inward. And then they weakened, they collapsed, not unable to hold the weight of the structure up above. We showed last week what caused the actual bowing of those towers, supported by the FEMA report, which said that the antenna came down first. So that sits on the hat truss, which sits on the core columns. So the core columns must have failed first, then pulling on the floor trusses, and then thus bowing in the columns. That's what we concluded last week. Now, NIST relies for their theoretical support for this column failure theory, which is essentially a pile driver theory, where the upper part of the building drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. That comes from, as you mentioned, Zdenek Besant from Chicago Northwestern University, who 2 days after 9/11 submitted that report, a 4-page, very detailed report, which we dissected last week. And I encourage everybody to look at part 2 of this 3-part series, free on YouTube. And then submitted 2 days after 9/11. I mean, we're all in shock trying to figure out what's going on in the world. And this guy's busy on his computer, apparently full-time for 2 days, probably full-time for 2 months, before, trying to figure out how to fudge these input data into this set of calculations, which he did do and did fudge, and we proved that last week. It's fraudulent. We've submitted an ethics violation around it because there have been engineers who have challenged this results, which was published on a peer-reviewed paper published by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they would not publish the challenge to this paper, citing that it was out of scope. Anyway, it's how can it be out of scope to refuse to publish the refutation of somebody else's paper? It's and that's why there's an ethics violation submitted to the ASCE. So there is no calculation by NIST. There was a calculation by Zdenek Besant. They increased the mass of the part up above by 3 times, 4 times, They decreased the capability of the structural steel underneath to resist that mass by 3 times. They completely eliminated a whole story of columns so that this upper part could develop an unimpeded downward momentum so that there'd be a dynamic impact on the structure below, which would never have happened because all those columns were there, save the few, maybe 6 or so, depending on which tower we're in, columns that were damaged by the airplanes. Completely ludicrous. That's the only calculation that was done. And that remains the key theoretical basis for NIST's theory. Not their calculations, but their theory. Now, what are the essential differences in the progressive collapse theories of Besant, FEMA, and NIST? That only leaves out FEMA, and FEMA had actually come up with a pancaking type collapse, which was rejected by NIST. So all of us kind of ignore the work that FEMA did there because it was overtaken in the official narrative produced by NIST. Andy, do you have anything to add to that question?
Not really. I think that was pretty thorough explanation there. So let's move on to the next one. It says in question 22 of the frequently asked question to NIST concerning the Twin Towers, NIST claims that there was sulfur present in the gypsum wallboard that was prevalent in the interior partitions. NIST states this as if it is a fact, as if they are not speculating. But I speculate that this is fake news from NIST. Is it still possible to investigate their claim of partitions containing sulfur to see if it is true or not?
Well, what we discovered or presented today was the fact that gypsum wallboard contains calcium sulfate, not sulfur. Calcium sulfate is inert. It's bonded. It doesn't release as sulfur. And again, in the 100-year history of using gypsum wallboard for protection of structural steel, it's never turned around and attacked the steel it's designed to protect. So it is a fact that there's calcium sulfate in gypsum wallboard, and it is a fact proven by the experiment that we showed today that 2,000-degree fires even cannot cause it to turn around and attack the steel. So that does not explain at all where the sulfur came from. We saw today where the sulfur came from. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. And sulfur is found in the ignited residue of the previously molten iron microspheres and the ignited residue of the found on the slags on the end of the beam, documented by Professor Jones. So I hope that helps.
Okay, now this is a question from last week that we didn't get to. It says there are several American science experts with fame who occasionally appear in the media. One of them was on a radio talk show and asked, why do idiots think 9/11 was controlled demolitions? He answered as if he only knew about the 2 Twin Towers. He said, in a controlled demolitions, you need to put dynamite at the bottom to make use of the entire weight of a building. But the towers fell top down and controlled demolitions don't behave that way. He added that only an idiot would put dynamite just at the top of a building and expect the entire building to collapse. Question, isn't having planes crashing near the top of the buildings almost the same as just planting dynamite only at the top like an idiot would do? P.S. I purposely didn't want to mention his name. Any comments?
I'd love to know this guy, this idiot's name, idiot scientist, because he's obviously not looked at any of our evidence and is making these ludicrous claims here. So I normally don't use names, but since he did, I thought I would throw it back. The controlled demolitions often start at the bottom to use the weight of the building to help crunch up the building, destroy it. But they don't only go at the bottom. They need to go on several floors because the whole weight of the building can't cause the collapse just by taking out a few columns at the bottom. That was proven by Professor Halsey, who had to take out at least 8 columns in Building 7 in order to get it to come straight down, as we saw in the 11 videos that we have of the collapse of Building 7, which looks exactly like a controlled demolition, which he proved basically that it was or had to be. So in the case of the Twin Towers, yeah, only an idiot would expect that the towers would collapse by flying planes into them near the top. That's not what brought them down. Not even NIST makes that assumption. NIST is blaming the ensuing fires after the plane impacts, up to an hour and more after the plane impacts, to weaken the steel. But that is idiotic as well, because it's been proven that fires could not have brought that building down either. And that's what the work of Tony Zamboti, Richard Johns, and their published peer-reviewed papers have done. Go to journal-of-9/11studies.com. Now, so what would they have done at the World Trade Center towers? Well, what we've shown last week is that they had to have explosives that were set off at the columns and beams in the towers below the point of jet plane impacts, rapidly advancing floor by floor. You can see these ejections of explosions and structural steel beams laterally ejected of 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections, laterally ejected, landing 600 feet in every direction, 60 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour, clocked by physicists. And you can see, as we saw last week in the presentation, isolated explosive ejections called squibs, ejecting 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the point of jet plane impacts. And it's just very clear that these rapidly advancing ejections are occurring at near free fall acceleration. In other words, we watched them in the video last week advancing almost as fast as the freely falling structural steel sections that they ejected up above. So it's rapidly advancing floor by floor. That was very clear. I encourage everyone to look at last week's video on this subject, 9/11 An Architect's Guide, Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. That's part 2 in this 3-part series. I hope that helps.
Okay, our final question says, and this is from last week, did NIST admit that they could not explain the collapses of the Twin Towers beyond initiation? If so, then why didn't NIST suggest to the FBI to look into the possibility that explosives might have been planted? I believe NIST said the idea of planting explosives would be completely impossible, but why would they speculate so if they couldn't answer beyond initiation?
I got to wrap my head around this one. Did NIST admit that they could not explain the collapses? Yes, they wrote us very clearly, and we showed that last week, that they could not explain the complete collapse of the Twin Towers. That was, they finally wrote that 2 years after we submitted that request. So why didn't NIST suggest to the FBI to look into the possibility? And I don't know why NIST does anything they do or doesn't do anything they do, but they should have suggested to the FBI to look into the possibility that explosives might have been planted. We don't have their internal memos. Maybe when this lawsuit gets going, because we have now submitted the request for correction to NIST, 100 pages long, with the evidence that we've been gathering, including the report on Building 7. That by Professor Halsey, that proves that it couldn't have come down by fire. I believe NIST said the idea of planting explosives would be completely impossible. Well, they're saying it would be unlikely because nobody could get away with it in those buildings. That presupposes that those people, were Arab terrorists wearing turbans, I guess is what NIST is saying. What NIST is unwilling to examine is that this was an inside operation with security being involved. And perhaps that was so ludicrous to them, that idea, that they didn't want to explore it. I can imagine them getting the government funding as a government agency, that to challenge the government on any aspect of its official narrative would be suicide for them. So they would not have gone there. But why would they speculate? So if they couldn't answer beyond initiation, because they had no choice but to speculate that the building then came down essentially at free fall, because the lower part couldn't resist the lower section of the building was not strong enough to resist the falling mass up above. That's their official speculation. But it's not, you can calculate that. In fact, they had 3 or 4 years to calculate that. And they had $20 million to calculate that. Well, we're going to be taking on the calculation of the destruction of the Twin Towers sometime soon. And we'll show that this is not rocket science. In fact, it's already been done in more simplistic form, and that's been submitted in peer-reviewed papers in the Journal of Protective Structures by Richard Johns and Tony Zambodi. Hope that helps.
And that was our final question today, and this is the last webinar for this month. So I want to thank everybody who's tuned in for them, and just let you know we're going to have them again next month.
Oh, we sure are. And that's the first Thursday in June at 1 p.m., followed by the second Thursday in June. This was part 3, the Twin Towers in Extreme Heat, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Last week, part 2, Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. Coming up in June, first Thursday, 1 o'clock, World Trade Center Building 7. If you haven't heard about it, it's the third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11. 47-story skyscraper that collapsed at 5:23 in the afternoon. Came down after witnesses hear explosions, drops like a rock, straight down, uniformly, symmetrically, at free fall accelerations, fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, right into its own footprint in the exact fashion of a classic controlled demolition. And yet NIST claims that this came down by normal office fires. And they have a 1,000-page report to try to prove that. And a ridiculous computer model, which you see here, which completely betrays the actual videos of the collapse. So we'll get to that, and I hope you'll join us. Until then, thanks everybody, and thanks Andy for all the great help. And bye for now, everybody.